What's up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishnev, and we are reading State of War, a secret history of the CIA and the Bush administration. Thought I got it wrong there for a minute. Remember, if you liked the episode, hit that like and subscribe button, and hit that notification bell, because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people from watching shows like this one. Let's dig in. Perhaps the most shocking thing about the American reliance on Curveball was the fact that U.S. intelligence officials never even met him before the war and couldn't talk to him directly. Curveball was an Iraqi exile who served as a source for the German intelligence service, and the Germans refused to provide the United States with direct access to the informant. The Germans claimed that Curveball would refuse to talk to the Americans, and so they would only provide reports based on their own debriefings of the Iraqi. What was... I'm imagining he's not even Iraqi, but German. What was worse for the CIA, the agency wasn't even receiving the reports directly from the Germans. Instead, Berlin provided Curveball debriefing reports to a U.S. military intelligence unit, the Defense Human Service, which then circulated the reports through the U.S. intelligence community. Defense Human distributed the reports without any vetting of Curveball's information. The CIA decided it was willing to accept these third-hand reports. With no ability to question Curveball and almost no way to corroborate what he was saying, the U.S. intelligence community still fully embraced Curveball's assertions. If you remember from the episode, they didn't just believe Curveball, they actually actively refused to listen to differing opinions. The October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction concluded that Iraq has transportable facilities for producing bacterial and toxin BW agents. End quote. Biological weapons. BW's biological weapons. The NIE said it had multiple sources for that assertion, but in fact it was based almost entirely on Curveball. But even as Curveball's reports were being given the stamp of approval in the NIE, Tyler Drumheller, and I don't remember what NIE stands for, I'm sorry. I keep waiting for it to say. Maybe he said earlier in the chapter. But even as Curveball's reports were being given the stamp of approval in the NIE, Tyler Drumheller was beginning to hear warnings about the source from the Germans themselves. As chief of the DO's European division, Drumheller was in charge of the agency's liaison relationships with Western European intelligence services, and so, in the fall of 2002, he had lunch with the Washington station chief of the German intelligence service. With war looming, Drumheller asked if the Germans were now willing to grant the Americans direct access to Curveball. The German station chief replied that meeting the source wasn't worthwhile because Curveball was crazy. It would be a waste of time. The German told Drumheller that his service wasn't sure Curveball was telling the truth, and worse, that there were questions about his mental stability and reliability, particularly since he had suffered a nervous breakdown. The message was painfully clear. The Americans shouldn't use Curveball's information. Drumheller passed on these warnings. I can read. Drumheller passed on these warnings to top CIA managers, thinking that that would be the end of Curveball's reporting. I said it is going to make us look stupid if we don't validate this, Drumheller recalled. But Drumheller hadn't reckoned on the strength of the agency's embrace of Curveball and his pro-weapons of mass destruction intelligence. By January 2003, Drumheller was shocked to learn that Curveball's reporting was going to be included in Colin Powell's UN presentation scheduled for early February. 1 week before Powell made his presentation, Drumheller was shown a draft of his speech. It didn't mention Curveball or the Germans, but it did include assertions about the existence of Iraqi mobile bioweapons trailers that came straight from Curveball. Drumheller wasn't a technical bioweapons expert, but he did know about intelligence operations, and he knew that the tradecraft in the Curveball case was shoddy at best. Earlier in January, the German intelligence service had sent a cable to the CIA saying that the Americans could use Curveball's reporting in Powell's presentation, but also warning that it couldn't vouch for the information. Drumheller realized that he had to move fast to get this flawed material out of Powell's presentation, so he called McLaughlin's assistant to set up an urgent meeting with the deputy CIA director. At the start of the meeting, McLaughlin's executive assistant told the deputy director that Drumheller had serious problems with Curveball. McLaughlin responded in a way that surprised and troubled Drumheller. "I hope not," McLaughlin said, according to Drumheller. "This is the heart of the case." The CIA's case that Iraq had a biological weapons program rested almost entirely on Curveball. Until that moment, Drumheller had no idea that the CIA had almost nothing else. Drumheller quickly explained to McLaughlin how shaky the case was and how there were concerns that Curveball might be a fabricator. As Drumheller left, McLaughlin told his assistant to try to take care of this, and Drumheller once again felt confident that he had prevented a disaster. "I thought they were going to drop it," Drumheller recalled. "I told the Germans they were going to drop it." Just to make sure, Drumheller's European division sent a copy of Powell's draft speech back to top CIA managers with the Curveball material scratched out. The night before Powell's presentation, Drumheller got a phone call at home from Tenet. The CIA director was at a New York hotel with Powell getting ready for the presentation the next day, and Tenet needed to talk with British intelligence officials one last time to get their approval to use information from one of their sources. Tenet asked Drumheller for Dearlove's phone number. At the end of their conversation, Drumheller took the opportunity to remind Tenet that Curveball was trouble. "I said to him, 'Boss, you know there are problems with that German reporting,'" Drumheller recalled. He said, Yeah, I know all that. But I don't think he was really paying attention. They had been up all weekend." The next day, Drumheller was at work at CIA headquarters when his wife called him. She was watching Powell's presentation on television and had called to tell him quickly to turn it on. To Drumheller's astonishment, he saw that Powell was making the forceful case for the existence of an Iraqi biological weapons program based on reports of mobile weapons labs. Drumheller turned to one of his aides. "Did we send them the right version of the speech? The one with Curveball's material all crossed out?" Yes, they had. A German intelligence official called. I thought you got them to take that out, the confused German said. It's like the worst case of hearing only what you want to hear that you've ever heard of, isn't it? It's like I'm laughing and on the inside I'm crying too, but oh. As late as May 2003, as doubts began to surface that there might not be any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the CIA was still trying to smother those doubts by issuing a paper stating that 2 trailers discovered in Iraq cinched the case that Iraq had mobile biological laboratories. In fact, analysts later acknowledged that the trailers they had discovered were used to pump hydrogen into weather balloons. The weather balloons were to be used by the Iraqis to help gauge wind conditions for its conventional artillery. When the Independent Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission investigated the curveball case, it questioned both Tenet and McLaughlin, asking about Drumheller's efforts to block the use of curveball's information. McLaughlin told the commission that he did not recall the meeting with Drumheller a week before Powell's presentation. Tenet told the commission that he remembered calling Drumheller looking for Dearlove's phone number, but he didn't remember any warnings about curveball. Drumheller has been deeply disappointed and angered by the answers to the commission. I think Tenet believed that they would find weapons of mass destruction when they got to Iraq and that nobody would remember those questions, said Drumheller. Why didn't anybody say anything before the war about how weak the intelligence was? I did, and I can tell you it was hard because nobody wanted to hear it, and they made it very clear that they did not want to hear it. The CIA's management team pushed aggressively on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction intelligence despite the fact that it had known for years that the agency's intelligence on Iraq was dangerously weak. Jack Downing, who served as the CIA's Deputy Director of Operations from 1997 to 1999, recalls that the agency's inability to recruit spies in Iraq was a glaring weakness widely recognized by top CIA officials at the time. He said he repeatedly tried to address the problem throughout the 1990s, but was frustrated that the agency's Near East division in charge of espionage in the Middle East never came up with any workable answers. We kept pounding away on the issue of why don't we have any sources in Iraq, Downing recalled. The chief of the Near East Division would come in with these PowerPoint presentations to show that they were trying things, but none of them ever worked. I knew that it was hard to get sources. It was difficult because we didn't have any diplomatic presence in Iraq, but we still should have been able to get some. Nothing much ever worked. Top agency officials were well aware of this failure. In the 1990s, Tenet had created a special hard target committee made up of senior agency officials which periodically reviewed the status of the CIA's intelligence collection on the highest priority issues, such as Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Those reviews showed clearly on top. Let's just start the sentence over. Scratch that out. Those reviews showed clearly to top CIA officials just how blind the agency really was when it came to Iraq, according to one former participant in the agency's hard target reviews. Everyone involved in the hard target review process knew that we didn't have any sources in Iraq, the former participant said. In the later stages of the Clinton administration, the CIA actually removed Iraq from the hard target priority list, according to former participants in the process. At the time, Iraq appeared to be contained by sanctions and the U.S. no-fly zones, and didn't appear to be a threat to the United States. While Iraq was being downplayed as an intelligence target, resources were shifted to focus more on Iran, several CIA sources said. That shift in resources took place in the late 1990s, and it meant that when the Bush administration came into office, the CIA's capability to spy on Iraq had been allowed to wither. It is unclear whether these glaring gaps in the intelligence were ever clearly explained to President Bush. It is entirely possible that the doubts shared by many CIA officials about the quality of the intelligence on Iraqi WMD were kept away from the White House. If so, that self-censorship may have involved the most important document produced by the CIA, the President's Daily Brief, an exclusive report sent to the President each morning containing a summary of the day's most important intelligence. One senior former CIA official reports that frustrated CIA staffers came to him to tell him that there had been articles written for the President's Daily Brief that raised questions about the evidence concerning Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, but that those articles were removed from the President's Daily Briefing before it was sent to the White House. It had not been possible to confirm these claims with other sources, but it does not appear that the President's Daily Brief ever reflected the level of skepticism about the quality of the intelligence that was widespread within the CIA. Should I read that again? It does not appear that the President's Daily Brief ever reflected the level of skepticism about the quality of the intelligence that was widespread within the CIA. Of course, it is hard to say how Bush might have reacted if he had received a President's Daily Briefing that raised doubts about the existence of Iraqi's weapons programs. He too might have ignored the warnings or even dismissed the articles, but it is also possible that he would have asked a few follow-up questions, which might have then forced the CIA to provide better supporting evidence for its many other reports that stated flatly that Iraq did have weapons of mass destruction programs. If somebody had spoken up clearly and forcefully, the entire house of cards might have collapsed. A little bit of digging might have revealed the truth. A post-war investigation by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence suggested that hard questions could have made a difference. Most of the key judgments in the intelligence community's October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate, the Senate panel concluded, were either overstated or were not supported by the underlying intelligence reporting. The independent WMD Commission went further, flatly stating that the intelligence community's pre-war assessments about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were all wrong. Tens of thousands of people died in our names. George Tenet is certain to be remembered in history for one memorable phrase: slam dunk. Ever since Bob Woodward disclosed in his book Plan of Attack that Tenet had assured President Bush that the case for the existence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction was a slam dunk, the phrase had stuck to Tenet and has transformed him into the face of one of the greatest intelligence failures in history. After the war, Tenet seemed angered that the White House appeared to hold him responsible for many of the weapons of mass destruction intelligence failures, at least until President Bush awarded him a Presidential Medal of Freedom. Tenet and other top CIA officials remained defensive about the CIA's failures on pre-war intelligence long after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. In early 2004, David Kay, the CIA's chief WMD hunter in Iraq, broke with the agency and said publicly that there were no weapons. Kay had one final private meeting with Tenet, during which Kay realized the degree to which Tenet had become personally invested in the existence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Kay believed that the CIA director was still in denial about the deeply flawed nature of the pre-war intelligence and seemed to be looking for some thread to hang on to. As Kay was about to leave, he recalled that Tenet said, "I don't care what you say. You will never convince me they didn't have chemical weapons." Finally, in 2005, Tenet admitted publicly that the slam dunk quote was accurate and ruefully acknowledged that those were the two stupidest words he had ever uttered. But thank you, George. I appreciate that. By the time American troops were ready to invade Iraq in March 2003, it was too late for anyone to consider the truth. The Iraqi regime desperately sent out a series of back-channel messages to try to tell the Americans that there were no illicit weapons, but no one was willing to listen. One of the most bizarre efforts by Baghdad to open a back channel with Washington came through an unlikely source. A Lebanese-American businessman named Imad Hajj, a Maronite Christian. Hajj had lived for years in the United States before returning to Beirut and had developed important contacts in Washington, including Richard Pearl, the influential neoconservative and outside advisor to the Pentagon. Hajj had also made intriguing contacts in Lebanon, including with a leading Syrian figure who, in the weeks before the invasion of Iraq, put Hajj together with Iraqi intelligence officials eager to get a message to Washington. Hajj agreed to fly to Baghdad, where he met with the chief of the Iraqi intelligence service. He told Hajj that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and to prove it, the regime was willing to let the Americans in to look for themselves. Hajj then flew to London to meet with Pearl and told him the Iraqis wanted to meet him to talk. Pearl called a senior CIA official to see whether there was any interest. I almost want to stop the episode there and have you put in the comments whether you think there was or not, because I think we have the same answer. The CIA official told Pearl that the only message they had for the Iraqis was that we will see them in Baghdad. Pearl later recalled, "Well, that's the answer." And so the war came. The initial invasion was a swift triumph, a masterful exhibition of America's conventional military power. The invasion went more smoothly than many imagined because Iraq didn't use any chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons against the United States troops. The protective gear American soldiers carried across the Kuwait-Iraq border turned out to be just excess baggage. Baghdad fell with little resistance, and before long, the CIA was ready to reopen its Baghdad station for the first time in more than a decade. Shaking my head. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, hit that like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when I make the next video. Thanks for joining me.